Hi, this is Ray Poynter here, and welcome to Futuring Friday, the last event of the week of NewMR. So I'd like to introduce the panel, and starting first of all, we've had Lenny Murphy was going to be with us today. His house has been visited by the flu, so Lenny and some of his children are under the weather. We wish them well, but we're very lucky to have, standing in at the last moment, Gregg Archibald, managing partner of Gen 2 Advisors, and Lenny's partner in crime, certainly in the commercial world. So hi, Gregg, good to have you with us.
And occasionally I do need to come off mute for you to hear me, don't I?
That's exactly right. Okay.
So Ray, thank you very much for the introduction.
That's fine, and we look forward to hearing from you momentarily. And we're joined by Kristin Luck, advisor, growth strategist from the Luck Collective, a frequent speaker at NewMR events. Hi, Kristin.
Hey, Ray. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Melanie Courtright, another frequent speaker at NewMR events, EVP, Executive Vice President, I guess, Global Research Science, fantastic job title, Research Now SSI. Hi, Melanie.
Hello, Ray. Thank you.
And we're going to stay with you, Melanie, because you're going to kick us off with the first topic, which you've highlighted as the blossoming romance between big data and big research. What's that all about?
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today. I'm really excited to talk to you about an increased trend we're seeing across our business and across our clients with regard to merging big data and big research. And so, said differently, we're seeing an increase in data sets that contain first-party data, second-party data, and third-party data, and we're super excited about those data sets coming together and some of the longer tail data sets that we're putting together. By way of example, you could think about Research Now SSI's first-party data being the profile and member data that we own. First-party data is that data that you collect and wholly own. We're seeing that merged with second-party data. Our clients, we work directly with our clients, and they'll do data matches to their customer data sets. You can think of an automobile company merging our data that we know of our members with the things they know of their buying clients and their transactions and their history with their vehicles. And then third-party data also coming in, putting third-party data being those data aggregator pieces of information, things like data from actual purchases, DMP data, ad exposure data, all of those data sets coming together to tell the entire purchase journey story. As an industry, we've been working on purchase journey for as long as I've been in it, which is a little bit of a long time. And so we are finally getting closer to actually being able to do true purchase journey from the point of interest and being able to append data around actual purchases and build triggers. And so research is beginning to enter into the actual working dollars of an organization, but being able to do so in a way that still keeps the practices of privacy and research rigor intact. So I'm very excited about the new data environment that is emerging. Big research is getting bigger. Big research is merging with big data. Big data is merging with big research. And it has been said that by the year 2030, nearly every data set that's out there will have both big data and big research in some form or element, and will also be blended with small research, which might be qualitative. And so it's an exciting time. The data foundational elements are coming together. The privacy policies are coming together. The tools and analytics are coming together. And clients are being able to do very, very cool things with merged data sets.
Well, that's a great introduction, Mel and Melanie. And come to ask Gregg and Kristin just to pitch in their thoughts in a moment. But I want to start with a question to you. What are we adding that they can't get with big data? Because you might imagine that if you're sitting there and you've got this really deep data about what people are doing, and it's a census, what is it that we can add to that process?
So the why and the opinions and the thought processes that go into the behaviors, the data that our clients have, and even the data that the DMPs have, the third-party data, it can tell a story about the what. But what it can't often tell you is about the thought processes, the values, the Maslow hierarchy of needs, thoughts, and impressions and value propositions that go into why people do the things they do. So we're and then what their impressions and opinions are of different advertisement campaigns that don't work and why they didn't work. So they still need the why. They still need to understand deeply the mind and the values of the consumers. And so we're able to add that with big research and with small research and with neuro research and with any kind of research that gets underneath the data and gives you the real insights as to what's causing and driving the behaviors that the big data will illustrate.
So, Gregg, what would you like to add on this?
So, this is a great point, and I've been saying the word data synthesis now for more years than I care to explain, because at the end of the day, we're looking for the truth, and the truth doesn't come from one data source. The truth comes from a lot of different perspectives to where you can understand an issue in its entirety. And we are seeing that with a number of our clients that are looking at some very traditional, improving some very traditional approaches to answering questions. So if you think about market mix modeling and you start to pull that back a little bit away from just the media, which we've looked at, and even when you start to throw in attribution, but if you take one step back from that, you're looking at what is the impact of customer experience, what is the competitive environment like, and when you add in those additional layers, you have a more honest perspective of the effects of your marketing efforts, thought leadership, social engagement, all of those kinds of things. We're also seeing this happen in brand tracking. There's a number of firms out there that are building more comprehensive systems rather than your annual or quarterly brand tracking survey that can provide a lot of additional information to help you understand what's driving the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of your brand through additional data sets that are linked together to be able to give a more comprehensive view of the consumer experience.
I love that you brought up the competitive environment. That's another thing, Ray, that the merging of all of these data sets brings. It certainly brings the why. But even if you work with a large brand that's mining their own data on their own customers and is working with a research company to get underneath the whys of that data, that's still only the picture of the people that they interact with. Merging all of the data sets together brings you voice of the market, lets you reach the people that aren't in your data set. And not just reaching them on survey type research, but working with a company that can bring you the survey research as well as the other first and second and third party data that come to fill out your entire voice of the market long tail data. And so it's it really creates a more holistic view of not just your customers, but the market.
Super. And moving to you, Kristin, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, to Melanie's point, the primary research, that primary data collection that research firms bring to the table is all about, that emotion behind or the why behind why people buy and why they do the things that they do. I mean, I'm excited to see the amount of, sort of emerging or secondary data sources that are available to us now. I was just at an event the last couple of days and I met Ryan Barker, who's the managing partner of Barra Brand Management, and they run this brand equity assessment platform that's really interesting. It kind of tracks brand love, and I can really see a lot of applications for merging that not only with primary data, but also with a lot of secondary data sources. And some of the I'm starting to advise more and more emerging brands on the CPG side, and for some of those clients, I can tell you that we are conducting some primary research, but we're also looking at a whole myriad of syndicated research products, in-store data, really paint like a really comprehensive picture of what is going on with the brand rather than just looking at single source data in isolation. And I think the unfortunate thing is that there aren't a whole lot of tools that manage all of those data types really, really well. We used Tableau to kind of create that brand picture, but the truth of the matter is it doesn't work well with primary research data. Likewise, a lot of primary research data reporting tools to date haven't worked well with secondary data sources. And so I'm encouraged to see the development of some of the newer platforms that are coming onto the marketplace. I know InfoTools just released InfoTools Harmony, which is an AI-driven reporting platform where you can also read in some secondary data sources, and I'm just at the early stages of testing that out. So I'm encouraged to see some movement there, but I do think that we've been a little slow as researchers to really integrate those ancillary data sources.
Super. Melanie, what are the problems that I've come across, and perhaps some of you have as well, is that a lot of these big data sets are owned by very different parts of the business. So it's not as if one part of the business owns the big data and another part owns the primary data, this first part data. It tends to be owned in different silos around the organization, and organizations are getting better at pulling it together. But how do you think that's going to end up? Will it end up with us all reporting to the CFO or something?
I actually think that what we're seeing is that the CMO is often the one that has access to the broadest set of data. The BI group is often really tasked with bringing the data together into data cubes and data structures that the organization can access. And the CFOs, from what we've seen, it may be different by company, certainly, but from what we've seen, the CMOs and the BI teams are the ones that are bringing it all together. And so your point is good, though, that it's all across the organization, and the data itself is all across lots of different companies. So you have to work with a company that knows how to bring data together into a coherent structure and understands data privacy and explicit permission-based data aggregation. So those are the understanding the tools, understanding the permissions, and understanding structure, and understanding where the data lives and data maps is no small feat. But the thing I would want everyone to know is it is happening. We are seeing it. We're working with some very large clients on some very cool data sets. And if you're not following the trend, I would encourage you to do so.
Now, I would just like to add a little bit to that, if we've got a minute, Ray. The issue of data ownership, data structure, even knowing that the data exists is a struggle in most large organizations, and that's an issue that we have seen consistently. Even something as simple as what is the market opportunity? There are probably 30 data sets that could address that in some large companies in one way, shape, or form, and no one knows what they all are or where they all are. And that data curation is going to be a more and more important role across time.
Super. I'm going to be looking in Twitter and in the question tool in a moment to see if we've got any specific questions. So if you're listening out there and you would like to ask a question, now is a good time to do it. And just before I do that, look, I'll ask one more question to you, Melanie. You're in a company that is a global organization, so you're seeing this not just in a North American context, but how much of this integration is North American focused, and how much is happening elsewhere in terms of sort of proportions or interesting things?
Well, the truth is that a lot of the clients that we're working with are global clients, and so they will often start with a U.S. implementation, but they quickly want to go global. They're global organizations, and they take on initiatives wanting to globalize them pretty quickly. So the rules and the policies and the privacy regulations are really different globally. So they want to work with firms that understand that and can help them walk that balance very carefully. But most of the clients that we're working with right now are global organizations and are doing global work.
Super. I mean, we should always bear in mind that over 40% of all market research, traditional market research, is actually bought out of North America. So it is always going to be a big share of the business
Right.
as one of those factors.
Well, and the U.S. market allows a bit more flexibility around how to put the data together. So they'll usually do their trial and error in English in the U.S., and then they'll expand it and iterate on it in the global markets and implement globally relevant rules as they do so.
Absolutely. Okay, we don't have any specific questions coming in at the moment, but we'll keep our eyes open, and we'll move along to Kristin, who's going to be talking to us about automation and AI. I thought that was hot in 2017, Kristin.
Well, Ray, as you know, with these topics like mobile, which we've been talking about for 10 years now, something can be hot for multiple years and still yet no one is doing it. I think that adoption in this industry is pretty slow. You know, I mean, like I said, I started talking about mobile, I think back in 2009. And I'd say, I just saw it on a private equity investor chart as like one of the top 3 hottest trends for monetizing businesses in 2018. So I think that we still have a lot of room to grow on the automation and AI side of things. But I think there's been a fair amount of discussion around the technology around automation and AI, and less discussion about how that technology is actually going to transform the industry as a whole. So there was an article that I read late in 2017 that talked about IBM Watson, and they were saying, IBM Watson has so comprehensively mastered bankruptcy law that there was a major New York law firm that actually laid off 50 of their top bankruptcy lawyers last year. So when you look at that and you think about, gosh, if IBM Watson can do that to the legal industry, what does that mean for market research? And I think workers in manufacturing have known about that kind of trend for years. You can look at the U.S. automotive sector, which is booming now, but with far fewer workers than when it was on the verge of collapse back in 2009. And I think as much as we wish it weren't so, automation absolutely decreases the demand for labor. And I know Steve Phillips of Zappy was interviewed not too long ago, and his argument was that automation in the MR space will free up time for researchers to be more creative and intellectually productive, which I completely agree with. But I do think also the likely result is that it's going to diminish the need for researchers overall. So those that do remain will be the ones that have the greatest intellectual prowess that guarantees them higher status and higher compensation and offers them a lot of job security. And I think those researchers are the ones that aren't so worried about data collection or some of these other functions that are really easily automated, but those who are actually focused on delivering insights and real business value, and that's where I see the most opportunity for the future of the industry. But it's interesting because Deloitte just published an article a few days ago, which is now the subject of much debate on LinkedIn. But what it found was that nearly 4 in 10 of the folks that they surveyed think automation will increase ethical issues and decrease job satisfaction, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then you look at what market researchers said, and among market researchers, those concerns are even greater. Nearly 6 in 10 are anticipating the negative effects of automation, which was really kind of frightening to me, because if we're afraid of automation, then how are we going to integrate it into our business processes, and how are we going to move our industry forward in a really meaningful way? Like, that fearfulness, I think, is really unhealthy. I mean, I understand it, certainly. I look at friends of mine that have jobs in data processing and coding or translation work. Many of those roles are going to be not automated in a not too distant future. But I think that there's a lot of value in looking at that fearfulness and then figuring out how as an industry are we going to evolve, and how do we create more meaning or new job sets for those who might be disenfranchised or put out of work by the automation.
Some great questions and thoughts there, Kristin. And I think we probably make that distinction between AI and automation, because a lot of automation has happened. I can remember when we used to punch things in manually. We were having a bit of a laugh before the start of the webinar, but we used to punch things in manually. Dialing used to be done by moving your finger around the dial, and the whole of the DIY change. So automation, I think, is unambiguously made a major impact, and it has led to millions of people no longer being employed around the world, but not people with executive jobs like us. It has been interviewers and field managers and the people who printed the questionnaires and the people who punched the questionnaires and then the people who did the telephone interviewing. And I think the change now, and why we're perhaps, Kristin, why we're hearing more concerns, is that it's people like us that might be automated.
Yeah, well, and that's where I think that there needs to be a real thoughtfulness about what do you contribute overall to the research ecosystem, and how can you be an insights leader and a thought leader. And I know that that's not a suitable role for everyone, and maybe everyone doesn't feel like they have a major contribution to give to the industry. But anytime I think about how my role has evolved, even hey, I'm not the world's best analyst, but I certainly feel like I have a lot of insights and unique perspectives to share. And I think defining what your key strengths and weaknesses are, and figuring out, hey, how are you gonna educate yourself or get additional training to build up your weaknesses, and then how do you play to your strength? I mean, I think that's an important exercise that anyone, regardless of what level they are in the industry, can go through.
Melanie, there's an awful lot of automation happens in a company like Research Now and SSI. Thoughts?
Yeah, I was just thinking, if you were to ask Research Now SSI what our major focus areas and growth areas are for the next 1, 3, and 5 years, it's automation and data solutions, the two things we've spoken about so far. We're seeing an awful lot of automation still, and it is automation of things that can be automated. I'm not sure I completely agree that it will reduce the need for researchers, but it will certainly change the types of researchers that are in organizations. They'll have to be much better at providing the value in the design and in the interpretation. They'll have to be really good at that data curation and data understanding, data analytics and data weaving, and they'll have to be providing a different type of value. There will be other pieces of manual that come in as we evolve into new areas, just like as we moved from phone to online, and things in online have evolved and automated. But automation is a major trend, and anything that can be automated is being automated. But at the same time, we're evolving into data, which is still a little bit manual, but it's a different skill set.
And Melanie, just to clarify, when I say it's going to decrease the need for researchers overall, I'm talking primarily around roles that are not, insights driven. So programming resources, coding, data processing, some of the jobs that really can be automated, which are less analytical in nature and less interpretive in nature.
Yeah, so I think we're saying the same thing. Those types of jobs will reduce, but they'll be replaced by these data geniuses and data fellows.
Yeah, agree.
And I have a little bit. Sorry, Ray, go ahead.
No, Greg, you go ahead.
So I have a little bit different perspective on this, and I want to frame this from the brand side research organization. When we think about the implications of automation, currently about half of our time is spent on process-oriented things that include what it takes to execute research, and then there's a much smaller percentage of time dedicated to understanding the implications of the findings and applying that to the business issue. There are a number of companies that have made this process much easier, and Qualtrics and Zappi, and we can even kind of look at it from a few different perspectives. But the marketing organizations are owning more of this process, this automation, engaging with the automation to get it in there and then to get the insights out. So I think a lot of our job in testing and tracking and business issues that aren't excessively difficult are going to be moving away from the research organization and into the marketing organization. It cuts down time, it cuts down expense, et cetera. And I think that's going to have an implication for research organizations overall. One of them is, definitely staffing, but the other piece is the shift in the nature of work will be to larger pieces of work and more strategic pieces of work. I think that's one of the big implications of automation for client-side organizations.
And just looking out there at Twitter and in the questions tool, we have at LeBright, at Lennyism, in the questions tool, we have people very much saying the same sort of thing. Lenny describes it as the #1 impact. Automation is inevitable, somebody else has said. We're fretting too much about automation. So I think that we're probably right to fret a little bit, because it will change the game. It will be the reason that some companies prosper, and it will be the reason that some companies fail because they don't adapt to it. And Gregg, I'm going to ask you to pick up on a question which came in just too late for the last topic, but applies to this topic equally well. Why do we sometimes see market research organizations, both insight departments in the clients and agencies, being too slow to adopt the new thinking about big data, or to be too slow to adopt the automation routes?
So that's a great question. And I think part of it is the nature of people that are attracted to this industry. And I think the idea that you can come in and assess how right or wrong you are through 90% confidence intervals, or plus or minus 5% on the sampling error, has an appeal to a certain type of person, and that person is generally risk averse. A few years ago, we did a segmentation through MindSight that Forbes Consulting had at the time about the nature of change and how do you react to it. And we had, these aren't exact numbers, but it's close enough. We had about a third of researchers that were saying, I don't want change, everything is good enough right now. We had about a third of researchers that said, you show me the proof and I'll think about it. And you had about a third of researchers that said, any change is good change. So in that mix, you have about 2/3 that are struggling to push towards change, maybe willing to change, but certainly aren't pushing towards it. And that's a big number to get that ball rolling. And it's a big number for that 1/3 to overcome. So I think a big piece of it is the nature of how we look at research. You have to prove it to me. It has to be valid. It has to be it has to go through that rigor and testing versus kind of testing on the fly, and the risk that organizations and people within the research organizations are willing to take to do that.
So Kristin, we've got a great question in Twitter here, which is, following this endorsement of these two technologies, should market research develop more marketing strategy expertise and worry less about methodology?
Oh, well, I mean, I think methodology is important when you're conducting primary research, but I definitely think having an understanding of all the different data streams that go into forming well-educated marketing decisions is really important. And that's where I feel there's some weakness on the market research side. Like, there's certainly a deep understanding of primary research and the methods that go around them. But for the most part, when I ask agencies from a brand perspective for the clients that I advise, there's just a complete lack of knowledge about all the different data streams that brands have available to them, and how that can create a more meaningful picture, and how do you use that in collaboration with primary research data. So I think that's one area where, hey, if we really want to provide value as researchers, it's getting comfortable with many sources of data versus just focusing on one, which I think was what Melanie really touched on during her example that we kicked off the webinar with.
And Melanie,
if I may,
Melanie, I'll just add one more piece to that and then come to you. So do you think, in addition to what Kristin just said, there are problems where market researchers believe their methodology is superior and are not really looking at the methodologies that other people are bringing to the table?
Yes, and I believe the reverse is true. You and I were having a side chat a little while ago. I actually believe that methodologies need to evolve in the market research world to accommodate larger data sets and different kinds of data. But I also believe that the data sets that are out there need to employ better methodology on how those data sets are interpreted and managed. Not every data set is representative. So you need to understand overall methodology not only in the market research space, but in how you manage data sets in general. So it's going to be important that the two groups learn from each other.
Absolutely. And one more quick question for Kristin, and then we'll move on. It seems to me that we often discuss market research as a monolith, when in real life there are quick tactical functional needs, more strategic forward thinking, and automation's going to impact each differently. We're going to see different impacts for different functions, different needs, different companies.
Yeah, was that a question?
It's
felt more like a statement.
Well, no, it's do kind of an old-fashioned phrase. You're probably all too young to remember. Does the panel think? So, do you feel that's is that situation? Do you think? Are we thinking about it too monolithically?
Probably
yeah,
so.
Possibly. Go ahead, Greg.
Go ahead, Kristin.
No, you go ahead.
And it kind of comes back to what we were talking, or what I mentioned a few minutes ago. If you're looking at testing and tracking, and even some of the customer experience pieces, those methodologies are getting embedded in platforms, and those are driven in solid methodologies. And this is a huge oversimplification, but it's kind of turned on with the flip of a switch. And once the switch is flipped, it can run and people can use the outcomes to change their business processes. Some of the other pieces that look at brand strategy, that look at segmentation and positioning, and those type pieces aren't anywhere close to that space, and are going to take more knowledge, more thought, more insight.
Super. Yeah, okay. Yes, Kristin.
I want to just jump in, Ray, and say I think one of the unfortunate, I guess, trends that I see in research over the course of my career, which I think has been to our detriment as an industry, too. I see more solutions and resources opening up for these types of clients is looking at early stage companies. You know, when you think that only 1 in 5 early stage companies is going to make it, and so much of our research services products, the things that we're trying to sell as full service companies, are really focused on big brands. We're kind of missing that whole smaller end of the spectrum, where I think services like Zappy Store and Pop are going to have a lot of success in snapping up those clients and building bigger relationships with them as those businesses grow. I mean, I work with a number of early stage companies, and the fact of the matter is, in many cases, we don't end up conducting primary research because they're cheaper, faster secondary data options that are more affordable, and we save our research dollars for the big money studies that unfortunately we can only get through primary research, like segmentations or ANUs, which are really valuable, which smaller firms can't afford to buy. And so as we see more of these early stage companies coming on the scene, that's one really great way that we can build influence as an industry and create a loyalty following for market research, is also by focusing on some of those smaller firms, which again I think some of the platforms and more automated research practices really honed in on.
Super. Okay, thanks, Kristin. And now I'm glad to say it's my turn. So we were all challenged to pick a particular topic, and I've chosen something which I think is the biggest mega trend going on in research, which is client empowerment. a lot of the things we're looking at are either creating or are being caused by, or both, this shift towards client empowerment. So we probably saw it first with the rise of DIY, which was a shift of power away from the insights department to other parts of the organization, but it was also a shift away from the power of the agencies and the suppliers of research. We look at some of the other big trends, the whole, the Zappy store, the automation, I can buy my link test for less money and it runs faster and I don't have to speak to anybody and I'm in control of the process, is all part of this client empowerment. We're seeing the big rise in the online communities. It's the strongest thing from the GRIT study coming through consistently, that clients are now creating these online research communities. They're doing their own research, they're in touch with their own customers. They use phrases like voice of the customer. They want to own that discussion. I do a lot of training with different organizations, trade bodies, global organizations, and 10 or 15 years ago, client side people were about 10 or 15% of the attendees. These days, they're about 50%. I do a lot of workshops around the world looking at how people should rethink their research. Most of those are with client organizations. These new tools, the data aggregation that Melanie was talking about, really puts the clients in the driving seat because they've got 1/3 of all that data, or 1/3 of the data is the stuff they own. Then 1/3 is owned by other data owners and 1/3 by research type organizers. So they've now got a major seat at that table. They have this commitment to put the customer at the center of the organization, which is not something most of them did a few years ago. And as a result, we're seeing this really big mega trend of client empowerment and really research agencies being disintermediated and made more external to that thinking. So that's my proposition. I'd love to hear what the rest of you think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And there's a number of client organizations for emerging brands that I work with, and I would say, in some cases, even these relatively small companies in less than 20 million revenue have a business intelligence unit now. So they're really investing in how do we use data to grow. There are incredibly smart folks in there, researchers in some cases. And I think there's less reliance on, oh gosh, we've got to form a big strategic relationship with a research firm in order to get this information. I think that there's a lot of access to information that clients didn't have before, and so they are tending to feel more empowered and not so reliant on traditional market researchers to do that work for them.
There was sorry, go ahead, Melanie.
I was just going to say, I've seen, because I've been in the industry a little while, I've seen this kind of ebb and flow of actual client involvement in the mechanics of research, and it always, I've seen, has been correlated to when there's a bit of a fundamental change going on. When there's a fundamental change going on and the brands aren't able to work with a single provider or with a single agency to sort of meet all of their needs, they tend to staff right up and find people who can help them move quickly to achieve the goals of the brands. And so right now, with the changes that are happening due to automation and the changes that are happening due to data, and then even some of the privacy and security and quality concerns that are going on in the industry, the brands feel the need to step forward and lean in. And then when the industry settles back down and gets into a groove with some of these things, they'll see them start to ebb away again because they have the agencies handle more of it, and then it'll staff back up when they start to evolve again. So I definitely see that trend right now, and I've seen it correlated to the amount of change going on in the industry.
And I think we have seen this in our consulting practice as well, but I was looking at some information a couple of days ago that was put together by Boston Consulting Group, looking at what CMOs felt were going to be the leading drivers of competitive advantage, and the number one category was understanding customer needs. So that is recognized as the tool for advantage, and the tools to gain the knowledge to create that advantage are easier and easier to use. I've said many times SurveyMonkey did not become a billion-dollar organization because market researchers loved it. It was because marketers had access to information from consumers quickly and easily to help them make decisions about understanding customer needs.
And I think we need to come back to thinking about what our industry is as well, because if we think that it's all about who works in the agencies, we're going to have the wrong view of the industry. Because if 100,000 people stopped working in agencies, research suppliers, and started working inside client organizations as insight professionals, that is no net loss to our industry. But the way we're structured, we would often see it as a major loss, as opposed to simply evolving with change and over time.
Ray,
Yeah,
I think that's
agree,
perfectly
Ray.
said.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
I
Kristin.
also think yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting too is that, I mean, the industry is fundamentally changing in terms of the method that we're using. If you look at SMR's GMR from last year, it shows a 2.4% increase globally overall, but that's really deceptive, because if you look at the chart of all the different types of research that are included in there, and you take out the types that we literally weren't doing 5 years ago, like web tracking and passive measurement, the industry is actually, it's grown smaller by 4%. That's a significant change year over year. So I think that we're kidding ourselves when we say that the industry isn't changing and we aren't losing business. I think we are, but yeah, I agree with you. If those roles simply got translated into client roles, we wouldn't see a net difference. But I do think that there's more change going on than that. I do think that fundamentally, if people are looking at and using data in different ways, and we really have to adapt to that.
Gregg?
I was just going to say something similar to what Kristin said, so it's redundant.
Excellent. Okay, so we've got at least one person who has just made a comment that they're struggling occasionally to recognize the difference between our voices. The gender split, I imagine, is fine. So if we could just, sorry, this is Ray. So perhaps just chip in your name occasionally, and that would be helpful. And we've got a comment here, and I'm going to read it. I've not been able to pre-read it. So supply side research is moving to buyer side. Do the supply side folks have the skills, you think? What sort of roles are you thinking of? Not sure that the translation. So sometimes people quite clearly go, and I have seen that a lot in the organizations I've worked with, that people have gone from supply side to be a client side insights professional. I think that for the growing number of people whose job in a supplier is client success manager, that is even easier. But actually, I am sometimes thinking that person A loses their job and person B is recruited on the client side to do the job, and they're not the same people, and they won't always have the same skill sets. Coming back to something that Gregg was talking about earlier, we may not need as many risk-averse, overly cautious people in the future. We will always need some, but we may need fewer of them and more risk takers who look at the evidence and then pick an option.
Yeah, I think, right, sorry, this is Kristin. I think too that to really be effective on the client side these days, you really have to have an understanding of other data sources outside of primary research. So I would say to anyone who's worried about job security or looking at moving on to the client side, like really have an understanding of the different types of data that ultimately drives business success in that category. You know, when I look at the types of folks that are being hired into business intelligence or research functions on the client side, they're certainly not people that only have primary research experience. It's having a larger breadth of understanding about data and data sources rather than just focusing on the data that generally is collected on the supplier side.
This is Melanie. I've had the benefit of being on the client side at brands like Texas Instruments and AOL, and then on the full service agency side for over a decade, doing full service, and then now at Research Now SSI in the true supply side, data supply side. And I'll say that those experiences have all really built on each other. I would say that the skill sets might be a little bit different, but there is no substitute for that kind of breadth. When I was starting out on the actual buyer side, client side, I wished I had more in the weeds experience. And when I was on the in the weeds experience side, I wished I could be doing more with the actual design. So the skill sets really help and build on each other. I do think the skill sets are slightly different, but I think there's a ton of value in the movement back and forth, both to the individuals and to the brands.
Absolutely. And actually, it is you next, Gregg, but not on this topic. So Gregg is going to pick up now on non-conscious measurement, which I think is such a better term than unconscious measurement. So Gregg, non-conscious measurement.
So let's take a look at this from a couple of different perspectives, and I promise I won't get into too much of a history lesson. But if we think about the marketing research industry and our kind of awareness and engagement with behavioral economics, which is closely tied to the non-conscious measurement. I'll go through that in just a minute. But it really started in, we'll call it 2005 to 2010, when the books were coming out, like Nudged and Predictably Irrational and Thinking Fast and Slow. It got a bit of a groundswell of support. The idea that we need to move things beyond simply the directly rational. So, but if we look a little bit before that, we've been doing this in one way, shape, or form since the 60s, primarily through projective techniques. So it's been our focus on the tools lately that have it's been the ability to have a framework for thinking about it through those books and the tools to make this applicable in research in some kind of scale. So if we think about that, our methodologies across time, for many 30, 40 years, we've had projective techniques. And then we started going into some other tools that said, you've got EEGs and MRI, which are not scalable, they're expensive, they're location driven. And so our methods have started to follow through from there to be a bit more scalable, cost effective, et cetera. And you've got eye tracking and facial coding and skin response, timing the response to a particular question. There are a lot of different ways to get there. So from the applications, we've moved. And so let's take a look at it from the demand side. I've been in research a long time. Until 1995, had never even thought about doing this idea of non-conscious work. And it was too expensive to do it for many of us for a long time. But with the advent of the new technologies, this is available in without cost prohibitions. So the demand is there, and we have a few indicators of that demand. One of them is the GRIT survey. So in the most recent edition that was just released a couple of weeks ago, we looked at new methodologies, and any of the neuro methodologies that can get to these non-conscious reads, any one of them is not particularly strong in terms of the number of people using them. It's around 20%, 10 to 20% on any one of them. But if you look at them in aggregate and said, who is using at least one of these things? it's over half of the researchers are using some kind of non-conscious tool in their research over over whatever period of time in the past year. And then another 30%, or just short of 30%, are saying we're considering it. So there's a demand there, and we're seeing this in IIEX, our series of events. We've gone from non-conscious being a track, a part of our main events, to having its own event, and now we're having 2 events per year, one in North America and one coming up in a couple of months in London. I think it's May 10th. That's not a plug. But the other piece of evidence that we see is clients are requesting this from as Gen 2 advisors looks to help our clients. Almost everybody is asking for some level of emotional measurement, whether that's through projective or metaphor elicitation or any of these other methods that we talked about, in all of their key ability to understand their business issues. So we're seeing the demand, we're seeing the tools that are able to meet that demand, and we're also seeing this show up in more and more surveys. We don't think that this is necessarily always standalone or even primarily should be standalone, but integrated into our processes now, so we can make sure that we have a good understanding as researchers of what that non-conscious influence is on our behaviors. And that comes from non-conscious as well as conscious. So our stand is that this should be integrated into a lot more surveys, a lot more data collection than we're currently doing.
Hey, Greg, it's Kristin.
Yeah.
I think it might be helpful too for folks that are listening who might be less familiar with non-conscious measurement, if you could give some examples of like the types of companies that are doing that work.
Right. So some of the methodologies in that mix are things like eye tracking. This is probably most prominent in advertising research, understanding where people's eyes are moving. There are some methods of eye tracking that can understand emotional engagement by the nature of how the eye moves. There's facial coding, and this has been around for a little while, where it's a tool that's looking at the muscles in your face to understand your emotional response to whatever stimuli that is in front of you. There's neuro methods like EEG and MRI that are looking at brain response under different stimuli. There's biometric responses like, I forget the name of it, so galvanic skin response. There's timed response, which says that if I can answer a question very quickly, I feel more strongly about my answer than if I struggle. Those are some of the non-conscious measures. We're also picking it up in things like the nature, the tone of voice in CRM kind of applications, that there's an emotional valence to the tone of voice, and that's able to be measured. We're picking it up in text analytics and social media analytics as in terms of the nature of how words are used lead to a particular emotional measurement within that. So there's emotional engagement across a variety of ways to gather that information.
Any thoughts, Melanie?
Kristin, did that clarify anything?
Yeah. I mean, I have a really good understanding of the space, but I think it's a little more nuanced for folks that aren't that familiar with it. So I think that's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is Melanie. The thing I would add is that we talk to a lot of clients, and all of our clients are saying something similar. They like the concept of merging this non-conscious measurement with other forms of data and using it to, again, get underneath the why of things and go really deep into psychological motives. and emotions that people are unable to express, unwilling or unable to express. And so we're seeing our clients ask us to not only merge all these data sets, but then merge methodologies to really get at deep insights.
So, Gregg, I'm going to now engage in pearl making, that's to say, to act as a piece of grit. We've got a lot of technologies, and my fear is that some of them will prove to be brilliant, invaluable, really essential for anybody that wants to get ahead. And some of them are going to turn out to either be indifferent or snake oil. So how should somebody who's thinking of using one of these new techniques go through an assessment process to look at how likely are the results to be meaningful and helpful?
So there are a couple of things, and one of those ways is to do multiple things and look for convergence. So when you're doing eye tracking and facial coding, and they have applications, if you're expanding those applications, then it's certainly something that you want to be more concerned about. So if you're taking facial coding from advertising to shelf, advertising, there's been a lot of work to show the alignment between the testing and reality. There's been a lot of work in shelf, but not nearly as much in that area. So as you're looking to move more into this, always encourage looking at this from multiple directions. And if it feels a little bit odd, stick with some of the things that are more tested. We know that text analytics there's been a tremendous amount of testing of that and expansion of the capabilities. Eye tracking, facial coding, pretty solid at this point, have a lot of good models that sit behind them. And if you're looking at behavioral economic models generally, at this point, there's enough in kind of benchmarking to see if what you've learned about your own company is consistent with what's known about similar situations. So I would look for benchmarking and some of the behavioral economic modeling.
This is Melanie. I would add that as researchers, one of the things that we're supposed to develop and really hone is our instinct, our gut. And a lot of times we get so deep into the data set that we forget to just take a step back and say, does this jive with what I know about my company, the industry, consumers? Does this data really feel right in our instincts as researchers and objectively? And so one of the most important pieces when you're trying new methodologies that are not really proven is to deeply rely on your gut and your instinct.
Okay, we're running a little short of time now. We've got one or two more questions out there in the question tool. So I'm going to ask the question, and then we're going to let one or two people from the panel chip in on those. And so here's the first one. This is Ray here. The old model was client knows the business, the research agency has mastery of data collection, and academics develop the methodology. So what does the panel think the new model will be in the future? Who would like a go at that one?
I can start, and this is Melanie, and then I bet others will build on it. I believe that the model will shift a little bit. I believe that that all three groups will need to know data in a way that they've never known data before. They'll need to know the types of data that they specialize in, though. So the brands will need to know their own internal data deeply, and then they will want to work with companies that know second, third party, or their own first party data deeply and can bring them together. So they'll all need to know data. They'll all need to know methodology. So they'll want to work with brands that fill in their gaps on privacy and on tech and on. So you think about the letter T, and we've always said that people should be shaped like the letter T. They should be great across a wide set of things and deep experts in a narrow set of things. So I think that that's coming true, that nearly everybody in our space will need to be great across a much wider set of things, but a deep expert in a narrow set of skills, and then brands will be looking for specific deep experts to fill in their gaps. That's my opinion. It won't be as clean. There'll be much more overlap, and they'll be looking to fill in their gaps.
Well, I will grab the second answer, Ray, here on this, and then the next question will go to Gregg and Kristin, because my view is that market researchers will not work in market research companies. I think that there will be the big data integration companies, a combination of sort of think Google, think IMS Health, somewhere around that, on the and the big management consultancies, and there will be people with market research skills in those organizations. And then the other place you will see people with market research skills will be in the client organization. But I think having niche organizations whose almost only function is market research, and who tend to have market researchers as their chief executive, are probably going to disappear maybe in the next 10 to 15 years. So with that provocative thought, I will read the next question and we'll go to Gregg and Kristin. Perhaps this question's moment has passed. No, it hasn't. We're asking it. What does this amazing panel think about? Well, you're not going to get Melanie and me. The role of business acumen for researchers on both the client side and the agency side. And how about the softer skills, things like influence and leadership? So, Gregg.
So, yeah, thank you, Ray. And whoever asked that question, thank you. Because earlier, I know about the time when you said it's past, because that's exactly where I was going. When we look at the skills to make a good researcher, whether it's on the client side or on the supplier side, I think at the end of the day, the ability to influence is the most important skill in the researchers that have done best in their careers. The ability to tell a story, their knowledge of the business, those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, it's about the ability to influence business decisions to the good of the market.
And Kristin?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think that the issue that I see that sets off alarm bells for me is that researchers really just don't truly understand what their value is. And there was a question taken from the Quirk's Corporate Researcher Survey that I saw that just kind of tells me that as researchers, we're just not thinking like C-suite executives. The value in research isn't on actions taken on our insight. I think that's a pretty egocentric view of research. I think the value is in business growth. How are insights being used to drive business growth? How are we impacting the top and the bottom line? That's the real value. And I think the more that we can think like C-suite executives and where we really provide value in the research chain, the stronger we'll be as an industry.
Super. Well, thank you all. And now we're going to our last question for a quick trip around the table, the metaphorical virtual table. If you had $100,000 to invest in a specific methodology or specific market, what would it be and why? And we are going to go to Gregg first.
Okay, I would invest in supplier companies that are focused on that they see their client base as the marketing organization rather than marketing research organization. So companies like Qualtrics and Alpha HQ and Transgressive X.
Super. Kristin.
Yeah, so when I think about where I want to invest my money, I really think about as an entrepreneur what that ultimate valuation of that company is going to be. So when I look at the summary of how companies are being valued now, if you look at data collection and loyalty companies like Ipsos and Nielsen and Informa, they're getting roughly a 10.1 EBITDA multiple. Versus business intelligence and analytics like IBM, Adobe, Oracle, Tableau, those are getting 17.2 times EBITDA multiples. So for me, if I was going to make a $100,000 investment, I put it in business intelligence and analytics any day of the week.
I'm going to go next, and I'm going to change the focus slightly because I'm going to say China, with the caveat that I've got to work out how to get my money back out and how to deal with the ownership rules and a few other minor issues. But it is an awesomely dynamic market. It is changing faster. It has got more postgraduates than the Western world. It's just so dynamic. The entrepreneurial culture is vicious. There are going to be an awful lot of failures, but some really interesting successes. The work that's going on in AI and facial recognition is really exciting. So I'm going to put my two penneth worth, or my $100,000 into China. Melanie.
I'm going to take a slightly different spin on it, and I'm going to say that if each of you listeners, if your companies had $100,000 to invest, and honestly, if I was going to invest my next $100,000, it would be in a security company, companies that help, especially in our new world of data curation, data privacy, GDPR, the directive that's coming out, fraud prevention. I would encourage companies to invest in third-party partnerships that shore up their data. At Research Now SSI, as big as we are and as strong as we are and as many technicians as we have, we actually still work with third parties that help us with things like IP and mail exchange, domain carrier fronts, and location and reputation, identity validation, two-factor authentication. So if I was going to have $100,000 to invest, or if your company has $100,000 to invest, I would strongly encourage companies to invest in security protocols.
Thank you, Melanie. That was really fast from the four of us. I hope it's been helpful to those of you outside listening. We've got one more exciting thing coming along in the next few weeks. NewMR, Sue York and myself are going to be running a boot camp on how to build your personal brand, and then you could be the new Kristin Luck, Melanie Courtright, or Gregg Archibald. So have a think about that. But for today, that's the end of the session. Thank you very much, and we look forward to you joining us again at some future date. Cheerio, panel.
Cheerio. Thank you.
Bye now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.